My rock and my redeemer. You may be seated. A touch of faith. A touch of faith. There is no faith without courage. There is no faith without courage. If someone came up to you and proposed to give you $5 million if you would go to the edge of a cliff and jump off, being told, without seeing the net, that there was a net down there to catch you, would you do it? But there's more. Let's say you met 3 other people who you trusted who said, oh no, I did it, and the guy paid out. It was crazy, but I'm telling you, I'm a millionaire now. You might think and consider, but boy, that's still a big risk to trust somebody you don't know and then to just leap over this cliff, especially if you're like on the side of something where you see the depth of the mountains and the depth of where you could fall. Some people might say, well, that's kind of an extreme example, Father Tom. But in our everyday lives, we are often faced with certain decisions that seem like that cliff. And we're not being promised any money. We're not being promised any necessarily prestige in this life. But Christ says, if you want to have life and you want to continue to grow and you want to continue to know shalom, peace, wholeness, you're going to have to trust me without the net. There's a song by a Christian group, Petra. It always sticks with me. And it's when it's reflecting on the priests when they're carrying the Ark of the Covenant and they're going into the land, and it says, essentially, you're not going to see the waters part until your feet get wet. Right? You have to step in and obey what the Lord says, even though it makes no sense. And of course, in the story, the priests were carrying the ark and the waters did part. Mark 8:35 says this, 34 and 35. He called the crowd to with his disciples, and this is in a couple chapters later than our story. He called the crowd with his disciples and said to them, if any want to become my followers, let them deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me. Now notice what he said. He didn't just say take up your cross. Let them deny themselves. And then he says, for those who want to save their life will lose it, and those who lose their life for my sake and for the sake of the gospel will save it. That's some pretty strong language. And I'm here to tell you, I think Jesus meant it, as difficult as it is to live out. Today we're going to look at this woman's life, and we see a courage, we see a desperation, but we see her making a courageous choice and believing Jesus and reaping the benefits. And when we follow Christ, we will reap the benefits too. However, there is no faith or growth in faith without courage. It will sometimes be terrifying. It will sometimes be frightening. When we know God's calling us to change something, we know we're reflecting his teaching, or he's calling us to be or do something that we never thought he would ever do. First of all, let's look at a desperate situation in verse 24 in our passage today in Mark chapter 5. Jesus now has been approached after he's come across. He's been involved with the healing of the man who had been demon-possessed. And he's met immediately by the leader of a synagogue named Jairus, and he's like, please come heal my daughter. So he goes, okay, and he's going along with him. And it is in this context that we find our story today, and we meet this woman. And a large crowd followed him and pressed in on him. Kind of bumped him around, I would say. And now there was a woman who had been suffering from hemorrhages For 12 years she had endured much under many physicians and had spent all that she had, and she was no better, but rather she grew worse. Now we know right off the bat this woman has money, or had money. Why is that? Well, for 12 years she'd been going to doctors. Most of the population, I would submit to you, that were under Jesus' ministries or exposed would not have had money to go to a doctor more than even a few times if they could go at all. So she had been spending money on an issue related to being a woman, probably had children before, and she had a continual bleeding that would not stop. Now, on first light, that seems like, well, a medical condition, but there's much more going on here for this woman and for the culture around it. This woman is a Jewish woman, and therefore she would have been, according to Leviticus, ritually impure. And if the healing did not continue, not only would she be ritually and spiritually impure according to the temple rules and the rigidity by which the current leadership of this day is applying those rules, she would have made anyone else ceremonially impure if she touched them. It's a tough situation. She's not only facing a physical dilemma, she is facing a societal and a spiritual dilemma in regards to how she was going to be viewed by people she loved and wanted to worship with. It's a desperate situation. She had exhausted all outcomes that she knew. And so secondly, we see a courageous act. And you may say, well, the desperation is what brought up the courage, but you know, that's what God does in our lives sometimes. We really won't move, and we're really not going to change, and we really still believe that it's better to hedge our bets or hedge up at the top of the cliff because it just seems less risky, and yet he knows that you will not have life, or I will not have life, or we will not have life if we don't obey and trust him. So while this is a desperate situation, she takes courage. It's a courageous act. Verse 27. She had heard about Jesus and came up behind him in the crowd and touched his cloak. For she said, if I just touch his clothes, I will be made well. Now, let's be careful here not to read into the text. She had heard about Jesus. That tells me she didn't know much about him. She knew of him, and this is why the crowds were following him. He was doing these amazing things, and his authority had a ring of truth that the other leaders didn't. But here she comes. All she wanted to do, she wasn't looking for a meet and greet. She just worked her way through the crowd, risking alienation and further scorn from anyone who might recognize her, and grabbed Jesus' cloak. There's no indication that she'd been told, hey, if you just grab his cloak. She said, I believe that who this person is, if I just grab their cloak, I'll be healed. You see, there's no faith without courage. Thirdly, Jesus makes a point and wants to acknowledge the healing and faith of this woman. Let's continue. Immediately, verse 29, her hemorrhage stopped, and she felt in her body that she was healed of her disease. Immediately aware that power had gone forth from him, Jesus turned about in the crowd and said, who touched my clothes? Now, I have to tell you, I really do love the disciples' response here, because it probably would have been mine. Are you kidding me? You're getting bumped around because there's so many people and we're going through these narrow streets. Who touched you? But of course, Jesus is talking about something they're not talking about, as is usual. Who touched me? And yet when she did touch him, the grace of God, whatever her understanding of Jesus and her faith that he could help her, and I think this reality of her heart in wanting to connect and still be a part of her Jewish community and her love for God, she reaches out and grabs that cloak and is healed. So what's going on here? Jesus says, "Who touched me?" And now we see with her a response that shows awe and a true peace that she finds. Not just an absence of strife or an absence of the disease, but a wholeness. A wholeness, but it only came because of her courage and her faith in Jesus. Verse 33. He looked around to see who had done it. But the woman, knowing what had happened to her, came in fear and trembling, fell down before him and told him the whole truth. And he said to her, "Daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace and be healed of your disease." Who touched me? He felt the power go out and she felt the power heal. Jesus wants to bring this up. He wants to bring this out of the darkness into the light. And there's no indication that he knew this woman was coming. And it's why we have the story recorded for us today. This woman who would be borderline destitute, sick, without help, comes and Jesus willingly heals her. And she comes trembling in fear and trembling. And I think this is more a sense of awe about what has just happened. She's probably overwhelmed. There's probably joy mixed in. But also fear, because if she's now known, maybe there will be repercussions. I mean, she's going through all these emotions she probably can't even sort. And so she kneels and essentially comes before with asking Christ for grace and mercy. And he gives it to her. He gives it to her. And what does he say? "Daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace and be healed of your disease." As we go through life, sometimes as we go through our day or our week, we are faced with realities and things that are out of our control. Relationally. You know, we heard today in the psalmist, both the Jeremiah and Lamentations and the psalmist, talking very specifically about peace. Talking very specifically about the idea of God's care and his love. Being still, trusting him when we can't control the things around us. And isn't that one of the hardest things to do? It brings out our continual need for sanctification, our impatience, our anger, our resentments, our fear. But just like this woman, Jesus is saying, I'll honor your courage. I'll honor your faith, but you have to step in the water. I'm not going to show you how it's all going to turn out. But I'm telling you that if you lose your life in me, you'll find it. I'm telling you that if you want to know faith, you need to deny yourself and take up your cross. And everybody knew what take up your cross meant. Go to the gallows. You can understand why this passage or passages similar are not often preached. Come go to the gallows with us, right out on our electric sign, right? Come deny yourself and take up your cross. Boy, that's not a good way to get people in. And yet, this was part and parcel of his teaching. As you read through the Gospel, see how many times he said things that would send a lot of American Christians packing. That's what faith is. Why is denying ourselves so important? Because we really think we're pretty important. We think our opinions, and I'm including your priest, we think our opinions should be listened to, no one should offend us, and we are the starting and ending of what we're going to do and how we're going to do it. And Jesus says, well, that's why you're unhappy. That's why you don't have peace and you don't have joy, because you are not to see yourself as the center, or myself see myself as the center. We are to see him as the center. And when we are conformed to the image of his Son, what happens? We become better community members. We become more forgiving. We become more committed because we see the lifeblood in it. And instead of being less happy and joyful and having hope, we find we have more, because crazy thing, this is what he teaches us to do. Jesus stands with open arms to me and to you, and he says to us, as extreme as it may sound, this week, here's your cliff. I want you to take the step off, and I'm telling you there's a net there, or there's another step. You're just going to have to trust me. What are you going to do with it? But do you know what happens each time we take the step? You might remember the Indiana Jones movie where you can't see any step, and you're supposed to get across, and he's supposed to get over there and pick the right chalice, and you can't see a step because of the angle, and he throws some dust out there. And then he's like, oh, I can walk on this. And even then he was a little hesitant because there was a chasm. Well, we don't have that. He says, okay, take the step, but you're going to be fine. And it's scary. Sometimes it's terrifying, whatever it is. But when we take the step, you know what happens with each step? Our faith grows, and we start going, oh, he is taking care of me. Oh, look at this. I'm not in control. Oh, wow, this burden's going. And we take those steps, and we obey him, and we're faithful. And it doesn't mean that while we're doing it, there isn't pain or there isn't confusion. But when we get to the certain point, we find out we've come out on the other side. And not only have we been blessed, the people around us find a similar blessing as we reflect Christ. This woman was healed, and I can't imagine the joy she had. Let us trust Christ. Let us follow him and trust him. And yes, that's a path. And yes, we only see where the lamp of the Word of God shows us ahead of the path. But let us remember and embrace the reality that there is no faith without courage. But when there is faith, there is great blessing. Thanks be to God.